Hello, everyone. Welcome in live nationwide and around the world to Ron Seggi today on this very special weekend, the 50th anniversary of the moon landing. And we have a show totally dedicated to that. Several years ago, I became very good friends with the first American in space, Alan Shepard, and we're going to spend the entire first hour playing that interview for you from over 21 years ago. Then next hour, the man who spent 50 years covering all the space shots from NBC, Jay Barbary, who has a book that is called Live from Cape Canaveral. Then we're going to have my friend astronaut Mike Massimino joining us and astronaut Winston Scott. This is going to be an interesting and fun show. We're going to pause for a second. We're going to dedicate this first hour to my friend of many years who passed away in 1998, Alan Shepard. We'll be playing that interview coming up next.
Welcome to Tax Talk with Hollywood legend Bob Eubanks.
You know, as part of Hollywood for a long time, I've seen my fair share of celebrities get in trouble with the IRS. Well, there's one name I trust, the Tax Defense Group. They're the most trusted name in tax. So if you owe more than $10,000 to the IRS, you really need to call my friends at the Tax Defense Group. Ignoring the IRS is not the solution. They can garnish your paycheck, levy your bank accounts, seize your home or business. But the Tax Defense Group could put a stop to all of that and tailor a program that would reduce your tax debt to pennies on the dollar. You gotta love that. So don't just take my word for it. Call them. Find out for yourself. They offer a 100% satisfaction guarantee. And they're open 24 hours a day because they know that tax debt doesn't sleep either.
Call now for your free and confidential tax analysis from the most trusted name in tax. Call 800-832-1594. 800-832-1594.
This report is brought to you by Bank of America. Bank of America was recently named Best Bank for College Students by Money Magazine. With so many new and returning students preparing for the start of the school year in the weeks to come, it's critical to have the right bank account for student needs. April Schneider, Bank of America.
It's very important to build a strong financial foundation early in adulthood. At Bank of America, we're committed to helping students start off on the right foot by providing them with best-in-class products like the Advantage Safe Balance banking account, along with educational resources such as Better Money Habits.
Bank of America's Advantage Safe Balance banking account allows students to bank without the worry of overdraft fees while providing them with full mobile access to their account. Eligible students under age 24 also don't pay a monthly maintenance fee. This account was named Best Student Account by Money Magazine and is used by over 1 million clients. For more, visit bankofamerica.com. That's bankofamerica.com.
Welcome into Ron Seggi today, live all across the USA and around the world. And as we mentioned in the introduction, a special show this week paying tribute to the 50th anniversary of the United States landing on the moon. And you've heard me talk many times about my friendship with Alan Shepard, who was the first American in space, and he also walked on the moon. And so now what we're going to do is go into our archives and play that interview that we did with Alan so many years back. So ladies and gentlemen, this is the first interview that was the start of a long friendship between astronaut Alan Shepard and myself. Ladies and gentlemen, Alan Shepard.
Well, thank you for having me, Ron. It's a real pleasure for me to be on the show here with you, and since I'm an expert in rocketry, maybe we can get the show off the ground.
We discussed on the way over here the possibility of what are we going to talk about this evening. Frankly, if I had the opportunity, this could turn into a radio miniseries for the next 4 nights. I could ask you a million questions. How does it feel to open up a history book and see your name in it?
Frankly, I live very comfortably with that, Ron, because none of us in the early days volunteered to be heroes. None of us volunteered to end up in history books. And the astronauts of today still feel the same way. The reason I make that point is that if a person wants to get involved in the astronaut program to become famous, then he has the wrong kind of motives. You've got to be involved in the business because you believe you're qualified to do it, you want to do it, and you're willing to take the time and effort to make it a success. So, although people say many times, I suppose, how does it feel to be in history books? And I'm proud of the fact that I am in the history books, but more proud of the fact that I've done what I've done as an individual.
Not only being the first in space, but also the 5th individual and a very elite crowd of only 12 to walk on the moon. Just a tremendous career. Now, you go back several years to being a test pilot. When the concept of the space program was first presented to you, how did you view it? I mean, what was your thoughts on it? Did you think that it was an idea that was far-fetched, or was it something that excited you and you could see the real potential of it ever coming off?
Well, actually, as you pointed out, once the decision was made to put men in space, the decision was also made that the pilots, the astronauts of that day, should be test pilots. They should be people who had flown airplanes at unusual speeds, unusual altitudes, used to being very objective, very dedicated in their training, almost to the point of being automatic, reacting automatically when something went wrong. So all of us were test pilots, and for us it was sort of a natural extension. Testing for the military involved flying airplanes higher and faster than anybody had ever done up until that point. So we saw the space program as being a natural extension of that, flying again higher and faster than anybody else. Although the nose cone didn't look very much like an airplane from the outside, with the help of the design engineers, we made it look like an airplane from the inside. In other words, it responded pretty much the way an airplane did. The one thing that we did that made a couple of the Air Force guys unhappy was we took away the rudder pedals, and a couple of our Air Force astronaut buddies said, "Gosh, you can't fly without rudder pedals." You know, you had a little hand controller that was pitch and yaw and roll. In the old days, yaw was the rudder pedals, and they said, "We can't learn how to do that." But we finally proved that you could, in fact, with one control, do pitch, yaw, and roll right there with a lot of practice, and so we're able to get the rudder pedals out of the cockpit.
And I don't mean to embarrass you by saying this, but when you think of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Charles Lindbergh, some of the great American heroes, you got to include your name with that. And of course, being the first American in space, fifth man to walk on the moon, back in the late 50s, was it not? 59, 58, and through there. Is that when the Mercury space program began, Alan?
Yeah, actually, I think everybody considers that Sputnik, the unmanned grapefruit satellites, in October 57 really started the space program. The manned aspect, as far as we were concerned, started in late 58. The selection program started then, and we were actually designated and showed up for work in April of 1959.
Now, when it was first presented to you and the 7 astronauts were chosen, did you ever think that you were going to be the first one of the 7? And the 7 was an elite crowd right there.
You got to be kidding, Ron. Of course I knew I was going to be first right from the start.
That movie was cool.
Well, I say that jokingly, but seriously, I think that, again, getting back to why people do these sorts of things, you have to realize there's a tremendous amount of confidence, self-confidence, a tremendous amount of belief in one's ability, and naturally everybody in the 7 wanted to be first, and naturally all the astronauts who are in training today want the very next flight that's available to them, because it's very much of an individual challenge. I just happened to be the right guy at the right time.
I know exactly where I was, and I can remember that day in May when you went up. But I wonder at the time, program really knew, or if you really knew, how many millions of lives that you are influencing, and how many young lives that you are influencing. Do you ever think about that? I mean, the magnitude of what you did and the impact that it was on the world.
Well, I do, and it's sort of in keeping with your place in history comments. Let me just say that when I was a young man, I was interested in building model airplanes, and Lindbergh, of course, was my hero, and encouraged me indirectly in those days to get involved in aviation. Of course, that led to my career, and it was one of the most memorable moments in my life to actually meet Colonel Lindbergh in later years, recognizing that was the effect that he had, to a degree, certainly on me. Then I can live a little more comfortably with being a hero, if you will, if there is some way that our accomplishments, and I mean all the astronauts of yesterday and today, can inspire youngsters to follow in our footsteps tomorrow, then it's important. And that's the way I view it. That's the way I view being a hero and being in history books. If we can use that credibility to encourage youngsters to follow in our footsteps, because there are so many exciting things to do when you talk about flying people in space in the years ahead.
I know the ambition and, of course, the goal of the Mercury program was to one day springboard that into a moon landing. But did you really think back there in 61 that it was going to come as early as 69? It's not a long time.
No, I think that's a very astute question. The surprise was not that we made the landing, but that we did it in the time frame that we did. And I think that's a general comment as I look back on 30 years of manned spaceflight. It's amazing how quickly we have come to the point where we are today, and how few accidents we've had in those 30 years. Of course, when you have an accident, it's always traumatic, but if we had said 30 years ago we're only going to have 2 accidents in 30 years of manned spaceflight, we'd say, boy, we'll take that right now, because obviously the risk was a lot higher, predicted to be a lot higher than that.
Let's talk about risk. You sat on top of that rocket in a very small capsule that was smaller than the size of a Volkswagen Bug and was blasted several hundred miles into space. What type of person, what type of thought process do you have to go through to be able to sit on that thing and not realize that you're on top of a potential bomb?
Well, I think most people think we have to be crazy, and a lot of folks in those days looked at us as being sort of strange kind of people, and I suppose we are unique in the sense that we recognize a challenge to our individual capabilities in that particular area, of course, piloting, willing to accept that challenge, and then willing to go through the hundreds of, yes, thousands of hours of training to be sure that we're absolutely, totally, properly honed and ready for the occasion, because if things go wrong, the pilots are supposed to take over and correct it and hopefully make the mission successful. One of the training methods which we used in the old days and as well today, I'd like to talk about, because it has implications in everyone's everyday life, and that is when one is approaching something unusual in their life. Let's say you're going to school and you're giving a final exam, which is very important to your degree, or let's say you're in business. You're going to a meeting which is going to be a decision which may affect the rest of your business life. You don't wait until the last minute to make decisions, to try to respond to that. You say to yourself several weeks before, say, well, what am I going to do if this happens? What am I going to do if that happens? You take the advocacy position, and then you've already made up in your own mind a situation, decisions in which you'd be comfortable. This is an oversimplification, but that's basically the way you train for spaceflight. You say, what do I do if this blows up? What do I do if that turns off? What do I do if the rocket doesn't go on course? And that's the way you train. It gives you the confidence to be an astronaut, and using that advocacy position, myself, looking at myself in the mirror, say, did you really do yesterday what you should have done? It's been very helpful to me, and I think if people do a little bit more of that in their everyday lives, it'll be helpful to them as well.
You're listening to an interview that I did with my late friend, astronaut Alan B. Shepard, the first American in space and walked on the moon, as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of the American moon landing in July of 1969. And there's more to come with this interview with Alan Shepard in just a moment with Ron Seggi today.
As a mother, you don't want to have to worry about this bill is coming, but then she needs this chemo. That's a decision you shouldn't have to make.
At St. Jude, a family never sees a bill at all. It's like the world has been lifted off of your shoulders.
The treatment doesn't get any better than what you receive at St. Jude. It saved my life. It saved my daughter's life. It saved our family.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures. Saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
As a mother, you don't want to have to worry about this bill is coming, but then she needs this chemo. That's a decision you shouldn't have to make.
It's a huge burden lifted financially, and so it allows you to give singular focus to your child. I've never known a hospital that takes care of their patients so thoroughly.
That was the first thing I was like, how are we going to do this? When they told us that we didn't have to pay a single bill, I was like, wow. They pretty much have saved us.
It's like the world has been lifted off of your shoulders, and now your focus is supporting this child.
There is not another hospital like St. Jude. The patient care is unmatchable. It saved my life. It saved my daughter's life. It saved our family.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures. Saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
It's pretty amazing when you consider that 7 years ago, we didn't have the treatments we have now. We cure 80% of children with cancer. Go back 50 years, we were curing 20 to 30%. This is the miracle story of modern medicine. We understand what makes this cancer tick. And of course, without donors from around the world, this just couldn't happen. There's one thing we're focused on, and that's beating this thing.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife. She was diagnosed with leukemia. In fact, she's a 2-time survivor. And in the midst of all that, they ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're Medi-Share members. And Dennis says they are so thankful for that, how others came together to meet their needs. And that's how so many Medi-Share members feel. This is not health insurance. It's different. You don't have to pay for things you don't believe in. And like Dennis found out, it just works. So if you join Medi-Share, not only do you save a lot of money, the typical family saves about $500 a month, but you know where your money's going each month. You're helping people. And if the time should come, they'll be helping and even praying for you. So yes, it's different. And as more than 400,000 people now know when it comes to healthcare costs, different is beautiful. Find out more. Call 833-34-BIBLE. That's 833-34-BIBLE. 833-34-BIBLE.
Back with Ron Seggi today, this week remembering July 1969, 50 years from Americans being on the moon, and we're replaying an interview many years ago that I had with my dear friend, the late Alan B. Shepard, the first American in space.
Just a couple other comments about your first flight, and then we'll go on to some other of the 40 million questions that I want to ask you today. How high did you go that day?
The first flight I made was classified as a suborbital flight, which meant that we went basically up to orbital altitude to get way out of the atmosphere. And then, because the Redstone didn't have enough thrust, total thrust, to put the Mercury capsule in orbit, came back into the atmosphere in sort of a ballistic trajectory. The height was about 116 miles, and the range at the point of impact was about 300 miles. The total mission took about 16 minutes, and only about 5 minutes of weightlessness. The zero gravity time was totally programmed, almost second by second, to indicate that man, in fact, would be rational while he was in zero gravity. He wouldn't have any physical or psychological problems, that he could, in fact, use this little 3-axis hand controller we talked about before and precisely control the attitude of the spacecraft. In other words, fly it like a test pilot. We went through all these things, and we really proved in that 5.5 minutes that man, in fact, could operate very effectively in underweightless conditions.
Okay, but Alan, you had nobody did on the whole support crew, no previous experience as to what would have happened. I mean, today when you go into space, you have 30 years of experience to bank on. But that first day, you didn't know if the thing was going to get off the ground, if it was going to be successful, if any of these things were really going to come into place. That had to be an extremely high-pressure situation because of the inability to know what was really going to happen.
Well, I think obviously from the standpoint of the mechanical, the possible mechanical failures, we were trained to respond in situation A, you push button B and all that sort of thing. And again, with respect to the physiological, how does a human react in zero gravity? Don't forget, we've been flying airplanes very high and very fast, and we had artificially created a lot of zero gravity time by pulling jets up at high speed and high altitudes and pushing over and essentially creating zero gravity. And matter of fact, in my own little airplane would get about 10 to 15 seconds of zero gravity time, so my little girls could float around in the cabin in the back. So it wasn't as if we're doing this sort of thing for the first time. It was a very carefully thought out program, and we were totally confident that things were going to work right.
I can't imagine, even as I mentioned on the way over here, going down I-4 in something the size of that capsule, let alone going 150 miles in space.
I can't imagine going down I-4 in something that size of the capsule either. We're on the same wavelength on that one.
Certainly a big difference between that flight and the flight later, and I want to talk about that in a couple of seconds. But before we leave the Mercury flight and that first countdown, what was your adrenaline like when that thing was counting down the last 10 seconds? I mean, it had to be at supersonic speed.
Well, I think I was probably metabolizing the adrenaline at a pretty good rate, a pint a minute or something like that.
Can you still remember that feeling?
Well, actually, at that point, I was totally comfortable inside the capsule. I'd been there for almost 4 hours. We had a little mechanical problem that had to be fixed.
You say that nonchalantly, out of there in about 2 seconds. They told me that.
But I was anxious and get ready to go. I knew I was ready, and I knew I was going to do a good job. And I was anxious to get going.
Think back to the original 7 astronauts, and I can remember looking in books in the library as a high school student at that time, and seeing those 7 astronauts, and everybody knew the names and everything about you guys as if you were famous movie stars, rock stars. You had your own niche as far as a following was concerned. Those names come back to me this morning. I was rambling off at breakfast. My sons were amazed. I said, you know the names of these modern contemporary rock groups? That's what it was like when we were talking about the original 7 astronauts.
I think that's true. And let me just make one kind of a comment along those lines. It was something which we lived with and do live with, and I hope we live with it comfortably. But you say, how about the guys today who will never be recognized to the degree we were? And again, remind you that they're there because they know they can do the job. They know they're qualified to do the job, whether it's piloting functions, whether it's astronomy, whether it's geophysics, whatever kind of experiment they're doing. They know they're well qualified, and frankly, the challenge to them is to do the job. And if having done that, then that makes their day.
You had, certainly when you came back, a hero's welcome, and one of the places that you ended up was the White House. I remember seeing pictures of you and President Kennedy. What was his response? What was the conversation that you had with the president with regards to your great feat? And of course, he was an individual who just was enthralled with stuff like that.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Ron, because what happened subsequent to my flight was really a surprise to all of us that were directly involved in the space program. I was scheduled to go to Washington, get a medal, ride to the Congress, say a few words, and get out of town because there was some other political things going on that the president didn't want, or at least his staff didn't want us interfering with. But at the end of the medal presentation ceremony, Kennedy said, we're going to have a change of plans. First of all, Shepard's coming with me. Now I'm going to go over and address and introduce him to the National Association of Broadcasters at a meeting down the street. Change number one, he said, secondly, after you finish the parade to the Congress, come back to the White House. We need to sit down and talk about what this flight has meant and what we can do in the future. We did, in fact, come back. The 7 astronauts, the heads of the NASA executives were there, several members of the Space Committee of the House and the Senate side, and sat there in his office. I have a picture of it, which reminds me of his total enthusiasm. He said, what can we do? I mean, this is tremendous. This is really great. They've captured the spirit of the American people. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out for the parade. What can we do? The NASA folks said, well, we had a couple of guys over in the corner that were scribbling notes about how you make an orbit rendezvous when you're in lunar orbit, and we're thinking about maybe going to the moon someday. And he said, I want a briefing. They briefed him about 10 days after that, and just 3 weeks after my flight was when he made the announcement. We're going to go to the moon, and we're going to do it in this decade. And I think even the NASA people were a little bit nervous, not about going to the moon, but about the time schedule, the time frame. Put a tremendous amount of pressure in the system. But it just showed how it captured his imagination, how Jack Kennedy was a real space buff. And he was just caught up in the excitement of people in space. And certainly that step, as unexpected as it was, put a lot of momentum in the space program that nobody really had anticipated ahead of time.
If you are just tuning in, you are listening to an interview that I had with my late friend, astronaut Alan Shepard, many years ago, as we this weekend remember July 1969. 50 years ago that Americans walked on the moon. Alan Shepard was the first American in space. We'll be right back with more of this interview. We are back with Ron Seggi today. We're playing an interview that I did several years back with my friend, astronaut Alan Shepard, on this very special weekend, commemorating the 50 years since we landed on the moon, and we're going to continue at that interview now.
You know, you think back now, Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, yourself, Gordon Cooper, Gus Grissom, Scott Carpenter, the original 7 astronauts. The movie The Right Stuff. How close to the real thing was The Right Stuff?
Well, I think with respect to the movie and the book as well, the storyline was generally close. And I'm talking about the competition among the individuals, the need for understanding between the engineers, design engineers, and so on, how we train and that sort of thing. The only difference I see in both the book and the movie is that the characterizations of the individuals were not all that close. And that, I think, primarily is because nobody talked to any of us about either the book or the movie. So you have a little artistic license here. One of the things that specifically bothered me was the fact that, you may recall, Grissom made the second suborbit flight following mine, and after he landed, the hatch blew off, an explosive hatch blew off, and the water came in, and Gus scrambled out, and the thing sank, and they said, well, Gus panicked, and he hit the switch and button and blew the door off. And, after about 3 or 4 weeks of testing, they discovered conclusively that that was not the case, that the thing was just too sensitive, and the rocking motion of the waves is what blew the hatch off. But in the movie, Gus was the villain,
Yeah.
and that stigma stayed with him for the entire movie. And I just thought that sort of thing I had problems with personally.
Yeah, that was a sad part of it, and he wasn't invited to the White House.
Yeah, he was never a hero anymore after that. Which of course, not only did he fly the first Gemini flight, he took my place when I was grounded, and he was assigned first Gemini, and then of course he was assigned the first Apollo flight, which unfortunately was when the fire occurred.
You talk about when you were grounded. At the peak of your career, here you are, a young man. You have reached new heights, literally. You're known internationally. You're at really the pinnacle of what's happening in an entirely new generation, and you're grounded because of an illness. Tell us a little bit about what happened.
Well, yes, generally, I was assigned to fly the first Gemini mission with Tom Stafford as my co-pilot, and we were already in training as a crew when I suffered a syndrome called Meniere's, which disturbs the vestibular in the inner ear. It destroys the balance, in some cases become nauseous, some hearing loss, and so on. And so the NASA people said, gosh, you can't fly for us anymore, but if you want to stick around, and we'll see if this thing doesn't correct itself. So they sort of put me in charge of astronaut training, and I waited for a while, and it did not correct itself. So I found a gentleman who was treating the problem surgically, and on my own, under an assumed name, I went through the surgical treatment, and fortunately it worked. And NASA looked at me for about another year and said, well, I guess you're back in the same shape you were, so we'll let you fly again. And of course, I was in charge of everything by then, and I immediately put myself on the next available mission, which turned out to be Apollo 14, some of the perks of being grounded.
Yeah, but it was a long time before you knew if you could fly again. It'd be like in my job, all of a sudden I found I couldn't talk anymore. That would be something that obviously would have a large mental strain on you, I would assume.
Well, it was difficult because, of course, part of my job while I was grounded was to see that the astronauts trained properly, take them down to the Cape, pat them on the head, and stuff them in the nose cones and watch them fly, and it was frustrating to me. Probably reacted in a sense that put more pressure on the guys in training than I would have normally. They called me the icy commander because I guess my frustration sort of, if I could see them getting sloppy in their training, I was the first guy to bring it to their attention. And maybe in retrospect it was helpful, but certainly as far as my personal credibility was concerned, it didn't help very much. But the desire was still there, and I think that's what eventually drove me, obviously, to having the operation.
What's the difference in sensation, Alan, between going up on that Redstone and going up on that Saturn V? You know, when I go over to the Cape and I see the difference in those spacecraft. Now, you know, you look at the Mercury program, you look at the Redstone, you say, well, that's a big rocket, and it is. Then you go on the tour and you see that Saturn V, and it looks like the Empire State Building flying down, let alone if the thing was, you know, in an upward position. What is the difference in the sensation launched from that?
Well, I think you could call a Redstone takeoff sort of like flying a fighter plane, and you could call a Saturn V takeoff sort of like flying a 747. Obviously, the Saturn V was a very comfortable vehicle, one in which we had a lot of confidence because of the fact we had some unmanned missions and then, of course, some manned circumlunar missions before the actual landings. Very pleasant rocket to fly. Physically, the only thing you have really is associated with the first stage. The takeoff, a lot of vibration because you have 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And then, of course, a build-up as the fuel runs out in the first stage, the buildup is about 4G. In other words, you're pushed back into your couch at a force that's equal to 4 times your weight. As soon as you're above the atmosphere, the first stage cuts off, and then the second stage is a much lower thrust and much smoother because there's no atmosphere to create any kind of vibration.
Is it quiet, or do you hear like you would in a glider or a lot of wind?
Well, you hear a lot of noise from the radio back and forth because there's a lot of conversation that goes on, particularly during the powered phase of any of the mission, because the folks on the ground are looking over your shoulder through radio signals and so on. So you don't really notice a sense of quiet ever. Nothing is really ever totally quiet because you never pull the plug on the radio, and some guy on the ground might have something important to say.
You would think so.
You'd think so.
What was it like to walk on the moon? I mean, that's a very elite group that have been up there, and I'm sure that at night when you sit at home and you look out and you see that, you got to have different thoughts than what the general public would have.
Well, you're right. There's no question about it. Still, some 20 years after my lunar mission, I never look up at the moon up there in the black sky without some kind of a flashback. Some of the moments of excitement, some of the moments of satisfaction, some of the moments of pleasure. I even think about my golf shot up there once in a while. But it's something, of course, that I don't focus on every single day. But every time I look at it, I think of some little aspect that happened. And I think perhaps the one that comes back the most is to think how fortunate I am to have been given the opportunity to be up there.
What's the sensation now of being on the moon looking at the Earth?
Well, I'm glad you bring that up. I think that we can talk a lot about how you walk on the moon, how you bounce up and down, how you collect rocks, and all the mechanics of that. And one practices for that so much that one really feels comfortable up there, if one can be comfortable 240,000 miles away from home. But the one thing that really was unexpected, even to an old fighter pilot like me, was after I'd been on the surface for a few minutes and we gotten everything organized, we had a rest period scheduled, and I just took the time to look up at the Earth in the black sky for the first time, and it was just an overwhelming sight. The Earth is about 4 times as large as the moon, so if you can imagine a full moon at midnight and something 4 times that size. But you see so much colors, a lot of white reflected, the ice caps on the poles, for example, the blue of the ocean, and the brown of the continents, the outline of the continents. And it's overwhelming because there it is, it's your home, and you think it's a huge, tremendous planet, which it is, when you're living and walking on it. But to see it from that distance and you realize that, in fact, it is very fragile, that we need to start considering about the environment and the effects of the ozone and so on, which, of course, space can do for us. And another thought I had was the fact that you don't see any political subdivisions. Here we tend to be so parochial about a county or a village or a state or a republic or whatever it happens to be, but you don't see those political subdivisions. You see it as a unit, as a planet. And I sense that someday perhaps the Security Council of the United Nations will have the opportunity to see the Earth from maybe not that distance, but several thousand miles, and realize that in fact, we are all related, and we are one people and one planet. As I said before, it was totally unexpected with me. I'm sure all of my colleagues have expressed this in some way or another over the years. So I think that people really have to experience that. For example, let's say you're blind, and I try to tell you what standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon would be like. I mean, there's no way I could explain that to you. There's no way that poets really could explain that to you. So I think that as the years go by and more people travel in space and recognize this feeling, that it will be very helpful to us.
In the event you just tuned in, you are listening to an interview I did several years ago with my late friend, astronaut Alan Shepard, the first American in space and the 5th to walk on the moon, on this special weekend remembering July 1969 and the world's first man on the moon. We'll continue this interview in our next segment.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife. She was diagnosed with leukemia. In fact, she's a 2-time survivor. And in the midst of all that, they ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're MediShare members. And Dennis says they are so thankful for that, how others came together to meet their needs. And that's how so many MediShare members feel. This is not health insurance. It's different. You don't have to pay for things you don't believe in. And like Dennis found out, it just works. So if you join MediShare, not only do you save a lot of money, the typical family saves about $500 a month, but you know where your money's going each month. You're helping people. And if the time should come, they'll be helping and even praying for you. So yes, it's different. And as more than 400,000 people now know when it comes to healthcare costs, different is beautiful. Find out more. Call 833-34-BIBLE. That's 833-34-BIBLE. 833-34-BIBLE.
Back with Ron Seggi today. For the past hour, we've been listening to an interview that was done several years ago with the late astronaut Alan Shepard, one that I treasure, and we're going to continue this hour from this remarkable American. Now, Alan, you're spending some time with the next generation of astronauts, are you not?
Yes, I am. Actually, about 6 years ago, the original astronauts got together at a function, and the thing was so successful, we said, gosh, maybe we really ought to use our credibility jointly to encourage youngsters to follow in our footsteps in technology and so on. So we formed a nonprofit organization called the Mercury 7 Foundation. Since I'm the youngest and best looking and most articulate of the original astronauts, I'm the president of the... Seriously, we have been very successful over the years in fundraising activities to provide science scholarships for juniors and seniors in college, the major engineering universities around the country. And we also tie in with Space Camp, because their youngsters are going through space training, building model rockets, becoming members of shuttle crews, and going through simulated flights and so on. It's something which we do, of course, on our own, on the side. Very rewarding to know that we are, in fact, directly contributing to the education of youngsters who will follow in our footsteps someday.
There's a toll-free number that you have that if somebody wants to get involved can call it.
Yes, the 800 number is 34-space.
I know, remember, 34-space. You know, I was mentioning earlier about the impact of myself. I can remember going under the steps in my parents' basement because it was shaped kind of like a wedge, and playing astronaut for days upon time. My father comes and says, "Where's Ron?" He says, "He's under those steps again, being that astronaut in that capsule, you know, and football helmet on, mind you." Speaking about your golf game up on the moon, you tell a funny story about being at Sinatra's house golf tournament.
Yeah, well, actually, the occasion had really nothing to do with golf, except I was had been invited to stay at Frank's house for a golf tournament, and invited to Jack Benny's birthday party. Frank was giving Jack a birthday party, so he said, "Clean up your act, Shepard, and come in." And so I put on my suit and walked in, and Benny was there, and I figured he'd just driven in to the Springs from L.A. So I said, "Jack, did you drive in from the city?" And he said, "No, we just came back from Mexico City. You wouldn't believe the altitude." And I'm looking at this guy, he's giving me, 10,000 feet is a big deal. I've been 250,000 miles away from home, and I say, "Oh, Jack." Well, of course, by that time he's on the floor, right? And I think it was 3 years later. He was in Houston, and we went to a cocktail party after a show, and walked in the room, and he yelled across the room, "You won't believe the altitude." Because they still tell that story. That was like 25 years ago.
That's a great story. Tell the story about the Roger Van Braun.
Oh, Werner?
Oh, Van Werner, rather. Van Braun.
Well, of course, everybody knows. Of course, Werner was the father of German rocketry. He came to our country, became a real patriot. But the story concerns the days when he was a young man over in Germany. And late in the afternoon, the schoolma'am came by and visited Mrs. Van Braun and said, "Mrs. Van Braun, Werner was not in school today, all day long, no Werner." And Mrs. Van Braun said, "Well, he's been playing in the field with his rockets. I'll speak to him when he comes home." Sure enough, sunset comes, Werner comes in, his clothes are all sooty and dirty, and Mama Van Braun says, "Werner, come here." Says, "You're a bad boy today, you missed school." He says, "Yeah, Mama, I know, but I'll hit it tomorrow."
That's great. Alan, what advice would you have for somebody listening to the show right now who hears what you've done and would like to follow suit? What should they do, he or she, prepare themselves for a career as an astronaut or in space travel?
Well, I would not limit it, my advice to space travel. And then go back to something I said earlier, that the techniques of analyzing one's individual performance prior to some important event in your life, whether it be spaceflight, whether it be drilling an oil well, whether it be making a pitch to the boss for higher salary, whether it be taking a final exam to graduate from college. I think one has to approach it very analytically and prepare yourself for what exigencies you can concerning that particular situation. In other words, I'm saying take an advocacy role. And in doing that, not only prepare yourself for any variations in the expected event, but also say to yourself, all right, now, did I properly do my job yesterday? Did I leave work before I should have left work? Or did I take a little extra time for lunch? And it's a very insidious thing. I think we all, being humans, tend to fall into that category. Mm-hmm. It's natural to goof off. It's natural to get back on your heels once in a while. And having seen that in the space program, resulting in a couple of failures, I have tried to analyze my life day by day. Look at yourself in the mirror every morning and say, okay, Alan, did you really do as well yesterday on the interview with Ron as you should have? And obviously I'm going to say, yes, I did a marvelous job. But seriously, it's the kind of thing you say, well, you know, I could have done this better, or I could have done that better. It's helped me in my everyday life, and I think that's the kind of thing, the kind of advice that I'd give to youngsters and oldsters.
It's good advice. What's the future of the space program, Alan?
Well, I think far term, there's no question about the fact planetary travel for people is in order and in line. How to get there right now is under discussion. There are a couple of fairly widely separated points of view as to how you do it. And I think these discussions should continue for at least another year, because it's an expensive process and want to be sure we're going to do it the right way, whether you go via the moon or whether you go direct ascent. But that will happen. In the near term, I see the space station as being the very next step, and I view the space station as being a monitor of the environment. We talked a little bit earlier about particularly the atmospheric environment and how the weather affects it and so on, the ozone, the greenhouse effect and so on. The space station is an ideal platform for analyzing these kind of things on a day-to-day basis so that we have data and we can tell, yes, in fact, this is happening or that is happening. Because our environment's important to us, and the space station is an excellent observation platform for that.
What do you do today to keep busy? And I know that you're busy as can be. I mean, you got a ton of things going.
Well, I'm a businessman. I own my own business. I'm involved in two things. I'm a developer of shopping centers, and I'm also a general partner in a venture capital fund. I'm a director of some mutual funds. Again, we get involved in trying to encourage youngsters to follow scientific careers.
But when you think of people like Columbus and the Wright brothers and Charles Lindbergh and Lincoln and Washington, you got to think of Alan B. Shepard, really. Your place in history is deserved. It really is. And I want to thank you so much for being a guest with us.
That's my pleasure. It's been a pleasure being with you, Ron.
Well, there you have it. Over the past 28 years and 19,000 guests, that is probably one of my top 3 interviews. He was quite a man. Apologize for a little bit of the sound quality, but it's an interview that I treasure. We're recognizing the 50th anniversary of the moon landing, July 1969. And for the past hour, we've been talking to the first American in space, astronaut Alan Shepard. We'll be right back with more of the show.
As a mother, you don't want to have to worry about this bill is coming, but then she needs this chemo. That's a decision you shouldn't have to make.
At St. Jude, a family never sees a bill at all. It's like the world has been lifted off of your shoulders.
The treatment doesn't get any better than what you receive at St. Jude. It saved my life. It saved my daughter's life. It saved our family.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
As a mother, you don't want to have to worry about this bill is coming, but then she needs this chemo. That's a decision you shouldn't have to make.
It's a huge burden lifted financially, and so it allows you to give singular focus to your child. I've never known a hospital that takes care of their patients so thoroughly.
That was the first thing I was like, how are we going to do this? When they told us that we didn't have to pay a single bill, I was like, wow. They pretty much have saved us.
It's like the world has been lifted off of your shoulders, and now your focus is supporting this child.
There is not another hospital like St. Jude. The patient care is unmatchable. It saved my life. It saved my daughter's life. It saved our family.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
It's pretty amazing when you consider that 7 years ago, we didn't have the treatments we have now. We cure 80% of children with cancer. Go back 50 years, we were curing 20 to 30%. This is the miracle story of modern medicine. We understand what makes this cancer tick. And of course, without donors from around the world, this just couldn't happen. There's one thing we're focused on, and that's beating this thing.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife. She was diagnosed with leukemia. In fact, she's a 2-time survivor. And in the midst of all that, they ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're MediShare members. And Dennis says they are so thankful for that, how others came together to meet their needs. And that's how so many MediShare members feel. This is not health insurance. It's different. You don't have to pay for things you don't believe in. And like Dennis found out, it just works. So if you join MediShare, not only do you save a lot of money, the typical family saves about $500 a month, but you know where your money's going each month. You're helping people, and if the time should come, they'll be helping and even praying for you. So yes, it's different, and as more than 400,000 people now know when it comes to healthcare costs, different is beautiful. Find out more. Call 833-34-BIBLE. That's 833-34-BIBLE. 833-34-BIBLE.
That's going to wrap up hour number 1 of Ron Seggi today on this very special weekend, the 50th anniversary of the moon landing back in July 1969. We've spent the first hour with a friend that I treasure his memory and his friendship, the late astronaut Alan Shepard, the first American in space, and then later became the 5th American to walk on the moon. Next hour from NBC, he spent 50 years covering all the space shots. Jay Barbary with his book Live from Cape Canaveral. Then astronaut Mike Massimino and astronaut Winston Scott. And that's all coming up next hour, live all across the USA and around the world. We're going to pause for a second. We'll be back with hour number 2 to our tribute to the moon landing.